Well, Nigerian bonds recorded some of the best gains in emerging markets on Monday. 5 of Nigeria's dollar bonds ranked among the 10 best performers on Monday in a Bloomberg index of 71 emerging and frontier nations. The development was attributed to expectations by investors that the candidate of the All Progressives Congress, Bola Tinubu, who had eventually won the presidential election, will implement much-needed fiscal reforms. To speak on this development and the future of Nigeria's economy with the new administration is Johnson Chukwu, founder and managing director, Cowrie Asset Management Company Limited. Thank you for honoring our invitation. Hi, Chief Johnson Chukwu.
Dr. But you started again.
But it's a statement of facts. A chief is a chief. Anyway, let me ask you. The main focus now is, what's the reaction from the market? What is ahead in terms of the future of the economy? There are many who have said, look, the primary task for the next president of Nigeria is the economy. What do you think should be the major highlights?
Okay, let me start from your first question, which is what's the reaction of the market? I think we need to understand how the market responds to uncertainty. In the first place, prior to the election, there was heightened uncertainty around the election. There were concerns by both local and foreign investors whether we're going to have a smooth election, we're going to have a violent-free election, and whether the outcome of that election will be acceptable to the majority of Nigerians. The first hurdle that was crossed, the election was, of course, it was not exactly free and fair, but it was not violent. I'm not heard of cases of reported deaths or people who died as a result of the election as we had in the past. So by virtue of the fact that the election was successfully held on Saturday, the 25th of February, investors heaved a sign of relief. So coming to the market, and what you mentioned that the bonds actually gained, was coming from the investors feeling a sense of relief that after all, the doomsdays are behind us, that the predictions that things could go completely out of control did not happen. So I don't think on Monday that it was certain who was going to win the election. So I don't think the market reacted because they knew for certain that a particular candidate was going to win the election. Because if you recall, reactions on the market on Monday was based on information available on Sunday. And as Sunday, yes, they were leading candidates based on results attained. But at that point, the number of announced results was too few to make a judgment call. So I think the market enjoys some form of relief, which is what we're still witnessing today. That today, the tensions are beginning to moderate. The worries that people had about the election are beginning to moderate. We've not had a perfect election, but it is not as bad as some people had predicted. So that having said that, now moving to the second aspect of your question, what is the economic outlook? What should we be expecting for? Looking forward to? The first thing we must recognize that the three major contenders, because I have to narrow it to the three major contenders, which were the AP's candidate, Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who has been declared the winner of the election, the Labour Party candidate, Mr. Peter Obi, and Alhaji Atiku Abubakar, who was the PDP candidate, were all considered as market-oriented, free market-oriented, policy-oriented people. I mean, the economic orientation was clearly free market-oriented. So anybody who was analyzing the Nigerian economic environment post-election and was expecting any of them could win the election should expect that should any of them be sworn in, we should expect some departure from the current macroeconomic environment, where we've seen a lot of lacuna in terms of physical presence, and we've seen an overdrive in the monetary presence. And we should begin to see some strategic direction on the economy, addressing some of the, what I may call, the heavy lifting that we need to do. And I believe that three of them had been very clear on the decision they would take on some of the elephants in the room. One of which is the issue of subsidy on petroleum products, the second issue on subsidy on foreign exchange. So those two factors, the fact that the election had happened and that any of them could win at that point was a relief to the market, and the market responded positively.
Okay, but I mean, you talked about the bonds market, but we saw a slightly different pattern in the stock market of Nigeria, which dipped after the announcement of the outcome of the election. What explains that difference?
Okay, in the first place, the bond market, you're talking about the Eurobond market.
Yes.
And the Eurobond market is a dollar-denominated liability of the federal government. So you have investors who are taking positions on dollar liability of the government. The local equity market is a naira-denominated market. So many variables also affect the local equity market, including the performance of quoted companies, the sentiment, which should apply to both, but the sentiment in the local equity market has to also factor in the fact that you're dealing with foreign exchange issues. And I'll tell you what happens. In the event of foreign investors coming to the market, and we have had a successful election, and they're betting on the fact that Naira will appreciate, what they would do is to stay back instead of converting their dollar to Naira at that point. So those who expect that Naira will appreciate will hold back and not make an investment. So I think what happened in the equity market was a case where investors were watching to see the direction of the local policy environment. And at that point, more local investors will be interested in what is the final outcome of the election than foreign investors. Foreign investors react in this way. Let's take a quick position such that, because if you're holding a dollar asset, you are kind of insured against some of the risk involved in holding a naira asset. You are at least insured against foreign currency fluctuations. But if you expect the currency to fluctuate, either positively or negatively, you are likely going to hold back and watch which direction the currency will fluctuate before taking an investment that is local currency denominated. And I think that's what happened in the local equities market.
Okay, let me ask you. You talked about heavy lifting. Now, the president-elect, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, he has an 80-page manifesto in which he talked about economic issues. But I would like you to interrogate aspects of his economic agenda as put in that document titled Renewed Hope, and then to identify those areas that the next president of Nigeria will need to do heavy lifting, will need to hit the ground running.
Okay, in terms of interrogating the 80-page document, a couple of both local and foreign institutions have also tried to interrogate that. There are areas of specific, where the document is specific. There are areas where the document is very generalistic. Some of the critical areas one was looking for, the document was quite generalistic. But one of the things I've also learned about governance in the country is that sometimes the manifesto we all hold and chew around may not be a product of the political leader. May just be a product of some consultants who have been engaged to prepare a document that will meet the expectations or the excitement of Nigerians. So if the recent history is tending to go by, I mean the history of President Buhari's government, you realize there's a direct disconnect between the policy, the manifesto of the party, and the policies that were implemented. I don't want us to go through all those things. I mean, we talked about, you talked about job creation. There was no relation to that. We talked about reducing poverty. There was no relation with that, with the final outcome. So, but what I want to emphasize is that, look, we should basically focus on interrogating the philosophy, the economic philosophy of the political leaders. And that will help us probably second guess what to expect. Because if you rely on the manifesto, like I said, there are areas where you had definitive statements. There are areas where you have generalistic statements. And some of those areas where you wanted commitment, I had mentioned the heavy lifting areas for the economy, which anybody who assumed the mantle of leadership of this country on May 29th should focus on. You must do the two heavy lifting. Address the issue of currency subsidy and address the issue of petroleum subsidy. You can't address the issue of petroleum subsidy because sometimes they are talking about we're going to take out the subsidy on petroleum product, but you can't do it if you don't address at the same time, in one fell swoop, the currency subsidy. Otherwise, you're going to be transferring subsidy from petroleum to currency. Because if you say you have deregulated the downstream sector and people who are bringing in product have to buy dollar from the central bank at subsidized rate, it simply means it's no longer free, it's not yet free market. So they are at poor advantage over those who have to go to the primary market to buy the same currency, to import the same product. So in that case, you have not deregulated. What you have done is shift.
You're saying we should have a single foreign exchange regime.
Yes, even we can't run away from that. The reality is that what we have today is not optimal. It does not encourage private sector investment. It's discriminatory. and it's not sustainable. So what I expect is that from day one, at the point of swearing in now, whoever is eventually sworn in, of course, we know the case still in court, and the jury is yet out. It's not yet out. So, but we have a declared president-elect. But we still have some months or some weeks to go through the tribunal judgment and find a definitive president-elect. So when that happens, whoever is sworn in on 29th of May should, in his announcement, his speech to this country, must announce removal of petroleum subsidy and removal of foreign exchange subsidy. If we do both, then we're going to begin to set the structures that we need to build economic framework that will allow for growth in this country.
One of the things the president-elect talks about in his manifesto is expanding the base for revenue collection, regulating digital assets, crypto assets, promoting financial inclusion. What's your assessment of this famous phrase, financial inclusion?
Okay, let's start
Let's
start from expanding the revenue base or the tax base of the country. When you talk of expanding the tax base, there are two ways you can approach it. One is to grow the pie, which is basically to grow the economy. The economy is less than $500 billion today. So if you focus on improving productivity of the economy, improving investment in the real sector of the economy, expanding the size of the GDP. The GDP grew about 3% today. If the GDP, which is where it should be growing, can go back to growing at about 6-7%, and then you grow the GDP to even 1 trillion naira, which we have mounted about a couple of years back, then even at the same tax rate, you will have much higher revenue. The second aspect of it is that to make the tax system more effective, to bring those people who are outside the tax net into the tax net. The third factor, which can be related to the second factor, is to increase the tax rate and then impose more burden on the few people who are paying taxes. So I want to believe that any good president that comes in should avoid the third option, which is to impose more burden on those who are already paying. Two things: expand the tax dragnet to include those who are avoiding taxes. Bring in taxes that are difficult to avoid. Because some of the things like consumption tax is difficult to avoid. We already have a lot of technological support today that you can bring a lot more people, a lot more companies into the tax net. And then, most importantly, grow the size of the GDP. If we do that, we are going to achieve that intended revenue growth that any government wants to attain. The other aspect of taxing cryptocurrency, and the first thing you have to legalize it. You cannot tax what is not legal. Today, cryptocurrency and all those instruments are not yet legal in the country. So I expect the first thing the government wants to do is to legalize it. When you legalize it, then you are now bringing it into the mainstream financial system. And then you can track their activities. And then you can impose the appropriate taxes. So these are critical things, but I have no doubt that given the level of revenue shuffle we have in the country today, one of the key things the new government must do is to improve on revenue generation. And for me, the base should be the grow the size of the pie. But in the short term, expand the tax dragnet to bring those who are currently avoiding taxes and those who are evading taxes, and make tax evasion major offense punishable in this country. Of course, the law about tax evasion is being observed in breach, because I can't remember anybody who has been sent to jail because the person evaded tax. So you need to have an effective tax administration system that makes it easy for people to pay taxes, and for those who are refusing to pay taxes to meet their obligation, their civil obligation to the country, that they need to face the law.
Okay, let me ask you, one of the things in the Tinubu manifesto is that an advisory committee will be set up to review the existing regulatory environment in the financial sector, and for that committee to make changes where necessary. Well, an advisory committee, haven't we had enough committees on these matters? And if we think that a committee is necessary, what are those things that you think we need to address within the regulatory environment?
Well, one of the things I expect that is Bola Tinubu is sworn in on 29th. If he's sworn in on 29th, is that he will certainly address that. You remember that under the current regulatory environment, there is a major concern about the activities on the engagement of the central bank governor in political activities. And I want to believe that any new president will have to address that at the legislative level, at the legal level. I mean, legislative at the law, the underlying law that governs central bank. And clearly, even if you look at the issue of Naira redenomination, there was a direct conflict between the APC government, excluding the presidency, and the central bank, who was in tandem with the presidency. So clearly, with that level of conflict, where I think it was Asiwaju himself or some of his spokespersons say that the CBN governor was partisan and had joined a political fray, I expect that with that undercurrent that we witnessed, the government will certainly amend the CBN Act. And that, for me, that advisory committee, that's going to be their primary responsibility, to look at the CBN Act, review it, and amend it. But I won't be able to be in a position to say how that amendment will flow, whether it will be driven by emotions or driven by sound logic. Because given, like I said, the conflict we've witnessed, if it's driven by emotion, we're going to see a legislation where directly undermine the independence of the central bank. But if it's driven by simple logic, where there are excesses on the part of the central bank, we have to cut those excesses and make sure we have a central bank that is financially and politically autonomous, but that cannot dabble into politics. We're going to have a piece of legislation that will meet the future need of the country.
One of the criticisms of Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu's manifesto, his economic agenda, and all of that as proposed, is that the manifesto is very vague about the fight against corruption. So, why the obsession with what the next president will do about corruption? And how does he address that big elephant in the room, a debt profile, as we have been told by, the debt management office of about 77 trillion?
Okay, let's start from the aspect of corruption. If eventually the president-elect, Asiwaju Bola Tinubu, is sworn in, and we have to recognize that we still have some last hurdle to cross. If he's eventually sworn in, the issue of corruption that people are interested in is one of the major cankerworm eating of the country. The reality is that corruption reduces economic growth, has a negative impact on economic growth of any society, discourages investment, taxes those who are upright and efficient, and incentivizes those who are not working hard. It does not incentivizes people who are not really working hard. So any society that has high incidence of corruption will certainly have some level of underdevelopment. So clearly, Nigerians have cried themselves hawks about the impact of corruption in the society. And Nigerians, for the past, if you remember, one of the factors that drove President Buhari into power was his anti-corruption stance and the commitment he had made that he was going to fight corruption. Okay? And if you remember, he said, if we don't kill corruption, corruption will kill us. You remember that phrase. So Nigerians are looking forward to a president that has a capacity, both in terms of strength of character and in terms of moral high ground to fight corruption. And they are looking forward to find that, look, you really can't grow an economy the way Nigerians want to grow if people are being, the system incentivizes indolent, lack of work, shortcut. So I can understand clearly why Nigerians are saying, look, every president-elect, everybody who is aspiring to be president of this country must be very clear, very punchy when it comes to the issue of corruption. We need to know where you stand on that. So it's clear why Nigerians are asking for that. Hopefully, whoever assumes that power, if Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu assumes that power on 29th of May, we should expect him to make a categorical statement when it comes to corruption. But the key thing is that fighting corruption is a complex issue in the country. And to fight corruption, you must have both moral rectitude as well as strength of character. You must be fearless, and you must be a person that has no baggages to stand before anybody and talk to the president in the face, I'm going to send you to jail because you have breached the extant law of the country. So I'm quite positive that anybody who assumed that power on 29th will also know that the power of the president gives you a lot of authority, that you can do a lot of things once you're determined to do it.
Okay. The other leg of the question, which is the debt burden that the next president of Nigeria will inherit.
Well, if you look at the fact that you just mentioned already 77 trillion, because we have about 44 trillion already in national debt, and you have about 23.7 or so trillion in ways and means. But there's also still some debt that we don't even seem to recognize. One, you have contingent liability of the federal government. There is a case in court where there is a claim against the federal government of Nigeria running into billions of dollars. Then you have instances where the federal government has entered into forward sale of crude for which the value had been received already. So in that case, you have a liability to supply crude to a third party, but the government has already received money for it. So these are liabilities, and then you have contractors' liabilities that are not yet factored. So when you add up these things, we're going to have something clearly above 77 trillion. But the key thing is that how do you deal with that? If you look at the report from the Federal Ministry of Finance, as at November last year, the federal government has spent 5.24 trillion naira in debt service. Total government revenue as at between January and November last year was only 6.5 trillion naira. That was 80% debt service to revenue. And that did not factor in the ways and means funding that we will now want to securitize. If you factor in that, you are certainly going to exceed 100% of government revenue. So the government has its job well cut out for it, which is why the emphasis from day one should be on closing leakages, improving revenue. So the government must come up with a clear strategy on how to shut down on excessive government overhead, on what you may call non-important or expenses that are not critical for the survival of the country. We must begin to eliminate those things that are not critical and absolutely important. And then the government must also focus on how do we grow the pie. One of which I mentioned the issue of growing the pie. But the government must also, in the first instance, address the issue of petroleum, crude leakages, loss of crude, because that's a shortcut, or what we call low-hanging fruit. If we can address that issue in the Niger Delta, probably will grow the revenue quickly, at least in the short term, before we do the other long-term measures.
Okay, I'd like to ask you those two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. The first one is a directive of the CBN that cumulatively directors of banks cannot stay beyond 20 years. 13 years ago, it was 10 years. Now, new policy saying, look, 20 years maximum from the point when you become, director. And we have seen at least one deputy managing director, Dame Adaura Emoji of Zenith Bank, putting in a letter of resignation immediately. And
maybe retirement.
Proceeding on retirement. Yes, okay. But the whole idea, according to the CBN, is to deepen corporate governance. What do you think of that new policy?
Well, I will look at it from two perspectives. One is that on paper, it makes sense. One is, in the first place, there's also what they call law of diminishing returns. If you've been on the board of a bank for 20 years, either as executive or non-executive director, you would have given it your best. If you get to the board at 40, you will be 60 by then. If you get to the board at 50, you are at 70. I mean, no matter how competent you are, new technology, new knowledge would have come in that would have displaced your so-called guru status if you were a guru at that point. So it makes sense at some point that people retire from whatever job they do and make way for new people to take over. That way you inject new ideas, new blood, new energy. That's one aspect. But the challenge you have is that when you have core ownership, the core owners, even when they were having their cooling period, I mean, when those core owners had done 10 years based on the old policy and had to leave the executive or the board to go and cool off before coming back as board chairman, they still call the shot. So how are you going to deal with that behind the scene influence of the core investors? Because clearly the core investor don't need to sit on the board to call the shot. But in terms of principle, the idea, particularly for banks that do not have core ownership, it will allow for regeneration of leadership ideas and therefore new energies and new ideas.
Well, finally, we can't have all this discussion without focusing on the elections. What was the big takeaway for you on February 25 and after?
Well, the big takeaway for me is that we can have a successful election if only the regulatory body, in this instance, Independent National Electoral Commission, is willing to do the right things. Technology will eventually make it difficult to rig election in this country. It may not happen in 2023, but I believe my take is that by the time we get to 2027, it will be virtually impossible for anybody to rig election. So there is strong hope that we're eventually going to have a decent political electoral process in this country. But we must all be willing to embrace technology. And we must continue to put people who have integrity and capacity into positions of authority.
Well, Chief Johnson Chukwu, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us on This Day Live, this Sunday talk show.